The latest installment in the Assassin's Creed franchise, Valhalla, has just been announced. I'm a really big Assassin's Creed fan, so I'm pretty excited about this. But my hype is admittedly held back by the fact that Odyssey, for me, was kind of a disappointment, and Origins perhaps even more so. Valhalla's premiere trailer has gone over really well, and a lot of the fan community is kind of waking up again and passionately discussing and speculating on the game, but there are a lot of people like me who can at best be described as cautiously optimistic, because Odyssey, despite being the best-selling game in the series' history, is incredibly divisive and has the fan base split completely in two. So in this video, we're gonna look into that. But it's my opinion that all of the controversial elements of Odyssey are symptoms of a larger problem faced by the entire franchise. I believe that over the past 13 years, despite some truly incredible games, the Assassin's Creed brand has lost its identity. Assassin's Creed is easily among the most iconic video game franchises of all time. It enjoys the kind of widespread public awareness that's typically reserved for your Marios and Calls of Duty. Never mind. Show your Uncle Greg a picture of Ezio and he'll probably say, "Is that Assassin's Creed?" before asking you why you're displaying a printed image of it to him without any context. But unlike those games, Assassin's Creed is a series defined by change. Mario, not that one, has been jumping on the same Goombas and saving the same princess for 35 years. Call of Duty has changed its setting and style a few times, but it's never not been about shooting a lot of bad guys. Assassin's Creed, meanwhile, can be Black Flag in one year and Unity the next. From swashbuckling pirate sim to Dumasian French Revolution murder mystery with revenge and a romance subplot and a lot of bugs. Every title is accompanied by a shift in priorities. Tone is all over the place between these games. Unity's self-serious cinematic feel is replaced by Syndicate's goofy shenanigans, followed by Origins being this spiritual ancient Egyptian mood piece. There are core gameplay pillars that carry through all of the games, but each title places the priority on a different one. You can typically expect an AC game to be, on a molecular level, about parkour, combat, and stealth. AC3 introduced a number of stealth mechanics which have continued to evolve through the series. Unity put a lot of love into the parkour department. Origins and Odyssey, meanwhile, have really doubled down on the combat experience. This all doesn't sound so bad, really. To be a franchise with longevity, you have to change and grow with the times. But gameplay isn't the whole story, and when you look at the big picture, it's starting to feel like Assassin's Creed is almost a ship of Theseus. The ship of Theseus, if you're unfamiliar, is a thought experiment. Imagine you have a ship. We'll call it the Jackdaw for fun.
You named your brig after a poxy bird.
As you go into battle, parts of it get destroyed and inevitably have to be replaced. After a long career of battling, a time could conceivably come when you have replaced every piece of the ship. If the ship no longer has any of the original parts, is it still the same ship? If not, at what point did it become a different ship? When the last piece was replaced? When half of them were? It starts to beg the question, what even is a ship? What is an Assassin's Creed game? If you compare Odyssey directly against, let's say, Assassin's Creed 2, just because while the first game is great, 2 represents the franchise really coming into its own. The iconic parkour is largely replaced with horseback riding to cover large expanses of territory, and you could basically play the entire game without ever having to do more than the most rudimentary climbing. Social stealth, a defining earlier characteristic, is no longer present. The combat has evolved from arcadey, Arkham-inspired attack and counter fare to a more Dark Souls-inspired dodge-heavy hitbox system, and in many ways it's become the core priority of the gameplay. There is one element that I would argue is more important than all of these things. I'll give you a hint, it's in the title of the channel. If someone asked me what an Assassin's Creed game is, I might not even think to say a game with Assassins and Templars in it, just because it would kind of go without saying. Yet, of course, Assassins and Templars are nowhere to be found in Odyssey whatsoever. A year after delivering a prequel game to explain how the titular order came to be, they followed up with a game further back in the past, thus predating said order. There are smaller changes too, but they really add up. No hidden blade, for instance. No framing structure of playing through memory sequences. No cool run around the Animus bit for loading screens or the interrogation cutscenes following your kills. In fact, the idea of assassination itself seems to have very little relevance anymore. Where a game like AC2 would be structured around memorable targets you hunt down one by one, Odyssey relegates this to a side mechanic which is little more than a list of randos you kill while raiding a series of identical fort structures. Oh, those fort structures. So many fort structures. Also caves. Beyond all of these omissions, they make additions to the game which can feel contradictory to what has long been the series' ethos. Dialogue choices, crazy fantasy elements like gods and monsters, and a more stats-based RPG approach all feel foreign to the vision of Assassin's Creed that was being sold to us just a couple of games before. For me, the most glaring difference is how far they've strayed from the core fantasy and iconography of the assassin concept. A blade in a crowd, carrying out assassinations for political purposes, convening in the shadows with a brotherhood of like-minded individuals. The ideological conflict between assassins and Templars used to be the central engine of the story, and each game's narrative was about presenting characters and time periods in relation to that conflict. Sometimes it was a classic good versus evil story with brave heroes taking arms against cartoonish Templar bad guys. Sometimes it was more complex than that, with star-crossed lovers, fathers and sons opposing each other, or opportunistic pirates playing both sides. And we could get into the modern day story, how that has changed, to put it kindly, but honestly, I could do a whole video about just that, so we'll save that for another time. With all of this in mind, does it really sound to you like Odyssey and AC2 are part of the same franchise? If you looked at both of them for the first time and had no idea that they were supposed to be connected, would you ever assume that they are? For me personally, I would say no. No, I wouldn't. Odyssey being a very different game from past Assassin's Creed conventions doesn't feel like a one-off diversion. It's just the most drastic step yet along a path away from those conventions, which they've been on probably since Black Flag. I'm not one of those people that's like, only the Ezio games are good. In fact, Black Flag is one of my favorites. I happen to be an appreciator of Syndicate, which is an unpopular opinion. And honestly, I'll say it, I don't think Odyssey itself is that bad of a game, but it does speak to a glaring lack of focus on the part of Ubisoft in regards to this franchise. There are a few ingredients of this problem that I'm going to touch on in this part of the video. One is just the realities of the development cycle. One is the trajectory of Assassin's Creed as a transmedia franchise. The other is Ubisoft's relentless drive to please absolutely everybody in the whole entire world. So until very recently, Ubisoft had been mandating that an Assassin's Creed game come out every year. Now, you might be thinking, if you're completely unaware of this process, how do you make an entire video game with hours of content and a map the size of Wyoming in just a year? And the answer is, of course, that you don't. They have multiple teams alternate release years, and each of them get around 3 to 4 years to take their game from conception to completion. In 2016, they took their first year off since 2008, and 2019 again was a gap year as well. But all that these gap years really speak to is the increasing time cost of developing a AAA game. These titles and our expectations of them have grown considerably since the first AC graced our shelves. AC Revelations was famously turned around in about 9 months. Unity then took over 4 years. The times required for these development cycles are varying. Valhalla has been in the works since 2017, but there is still the reality that at any given point in time at Ubisoft, there are likely 3 Assassin's Creed games in concurrent development. The game that will come after Valhalla has probably been in development for 2 or more years. The game coming after that game could be in pre-production right now. I do not envy Ubisoft's position here. If you are overseeing the Assassin's Creed franchise and you want to maintain a narrative and stylistic focus for any period of time, you need to be on top of multiple development teams. Never mind the fact that each of these games are the product of collaborations between as many as 15 studios in Valhalla's case. No wonder these games are inconsistent. The fact that any single game feels like a coherent product is a miracle in and of itself. I'm going to talk more about this in my eventual video about AC's modern day storyline because it is literally the perfect example of how that logistical clusterfuck can manifest itself in janky, confusing storytelling. So now, imagine that on top of trying to maintain consistency across many AAA games in simultaneous development, you are also trying to expand Assassin's Creed into a transmedia juggernaut with spin-off games, comics, novels, terrible movies, anime, and a live concert series. Yeah, I'm shitting my pants too, Ubisoft. You're not alone. The transmedia ambitions of the series have imposed some storytelling limitations upon it. One is that for a while, there was a desire to keep the story moving in real time, year by year. Another is that every time you use one of these alternate mediums to tell an Assassin's Creed story in a particular time period, you are required by fandom law to stick to the canon of that story in everything else. This is, for example, why Valhalla's iteration of Eagle Vision is referred to as Odin's Sight, because a young adult novel called Last Descendants: Fate of the Gods already established that. These challenges are intertwined with the idea that in order to make a transmedia franchise compelling across all these different mediums, they have to be part of the same ongoing chronology or canon. From the outset of the AC franchise, the premise we were sold on was that of an expansive alternate history, defined by a secret, epic, centuries-old conflict between two factions. As soon as the sequel jumped into Renaissance Italy instead of staying in the Third Crusade Holy Land, we knew this franchise could go anywhere, and go anywhere it did. A lot of the fun and excitement of being an AC fan is speculating on how future games and settings will be integrated into the broader tapestry of Assassins v Templars. Giving context to historical fiction by way of a global ancient war of good versus evil, freedom versus order, it's just so appealing and so satisfying to see it done well. Only in these past couple of games have we started to see Ubisoft diverging from that vision. For those of us who are always in love with that element of the Assassin's Creed experience, it's bizarre to play a new entry and find, for instance, that the story will play out completely differently for every player. I'm generally cool with having gender options for the main character, for instance, but then it introduces the awkward wrinkle of having to determine a canon gender and a canon sequence of events. And if you as a player are here partially because you want to see what exciting ways that canon will be expanded, to find that you might not really know from playing what is and isn't a part of the universe history books. That's frustrating. And what would drive Ubisoft to abandon that part of the series' ethos? This is where that classic Ubisoft relentless drive to please every single person on the planet of the Earth comes in. Now listen, I get it. You're a company. You want to make money. This is a profit-driven art form. You would be stupid to do anything less than try to make your games as profitable as possible. I will never shame companies for being profit-driven, because if you do that, your issue is not with Ubisoft or the games industry, but with capitalism, and that's a subject for another video. Just kidding. Not going to touch that one. But think about this. Plenty of games are incredibly profitable without compromising their core visions to suit an insanely wide variety of audience preferences and playstyles. Red Dead Redemption 2 sold more copies than the Holy Bible, and that's a game that sticks rigidly to a single vision that can, for some players, be alienating. As customers, we tend to respect games for sticking to the goals they set for themselves. I'm like a lot of AC community members in the sense that, in regards to the gender selection options on Odyssey as well as Valhalla, I would prefer the writers choose the gender of their characters for us and let us deal with it. I would love if that meant a female protagonist in a main title who also gets front and center in the marketing campaign, because even though a lot of us chose to play Alexios despite his inferiority, that doesn't mean we wouldn't have played the game at all if Cassandra was the de facto lead. The reason there's been such an increased emphasis on RPG mechanics like leveling, skill trees, stats management, etc., is because Ubisoft believes that systems like these will encourage player engagement and allow them to spec their character towards a particular playstyle. Instead of having stealth, combat, and let's say archery all be components of the game that you're encouraged to participate in, they let you kind of choose the one you like best and spec out your assassin, Theseus, accordingly. I'm a player who enjoys stealth. I want to sneak into a fort, do recon with my eagle friend, and plan my moves around the base to stay hidden, kill guards, and steal things. First, there's the fact that the game cares more about its leveling system than the gameplay experience, so if I want to stab from behind a higher level enemy than myself, I cannot, and I will trigger open combat. This sucks because it means that in many instances early game, I just can't be stealthy. Odyssey says, fuck your playstyle, do my combat now. The other problem is that if I really want to have an efficient stealth playstyle, I have to tediously, boringly scan through all my loot, select the items with the right stat boosts, manage all the engravings on my weapons to have little piddly percentage increases to damage, and basically I can't imagine anything in the world I want to do less. All of this in context makes Odyssey a perfect example of how, in trying to build a game that can be shaped to please any possible playstyle, it really ended up being a bad to mediocre implementation of each one. All of these things together, the one-size-fits-nobody RPG system, the abandonment of historical canon, and the pressures of an ambitious development cycle, they create a franchise that no longer feels consistent with the goals it once set for itself. I think there's a reason that in the past, Assassin's Creed was the innovator that other game franchises copied, and now Assassin's Creed itself often takes successful elements of more popular games like The Witcher 3 and tries to incorporate them. As far as hardcore AC fans are concerned, we want a game that fits into a cohesive transmedia narrative canon. We want the aesthetic trappings and style associated with the Assassin experience. We want focused gameplay that isn't trying to be everything for everybody. As of Odyssey, that is no longer the product we are getting. This is not all doom and gloom, because despite all of the dramatic changes I've mentioned, all of the ways that Odyssey has morphed the franchise into something completely unfamiliar to the games before it, there is one thing about Assassin's Creed that has always been true and will always be true. One thing that describes every game in the series in relation to each other: that it changes. AC takes big swings sometimes. Remember when Black Flag's naval combat was incredibly popular with critics, and fans started to wonder if naval combat would become a staple feature of the series? Well, as we all know, next year's main title got rid of it entirely, and while it's popped up in some places, including Odyssey itself, it's never been to the same extent as Black Flag. Valhalla is looking to be one of the more iterative games in the series. It will likely inherit a great deal from Odyssey and Origins, and generally not rock the boat all that much. If you hate those games, Valhalla probably won't appeal to you either. But they can't make games this way forever. Valhalla is likely to be the last AC title on the current iteration of the AC engine. Every game since Unity has been using Anvil Next 2.0. A new generation of console hardware on the horizon means that the engine will have to be significantly retooled. If you remember the transition from the last console generation into the current one, Black Flag was a cross-generation title, the same way Valhalla will be. The next year, we got Unity. That jump is probably the biggest leap in terms of technology and focus that the franchise has ever seen. And sure, there are going to be things I don't like about Odyssey that stick around. Dialogue choices are likely here to stay, the RPG systems will probably hold out as well. But this franchise just can't resist changing every once in a while, especially not when there are big technological advances to take advantage of. After Valhalla launches, we're going to get an AC title at some point that is exclusively built for next-gen consoles, and not held back by the limitations of the previous ones. For this game, the sky's the limit for what's possible. I can't imagine yet another game in the series feeling as close to Origins as Odyssey did, and Valhalla likely will. There are so many different styles of gameplay and design in the series history. We could see a return to one that worked well in the past, or we could see an evolution towards something entirely new. I would love to see a return to the Unity and Syndicate style of urban parkour in a relatively modern setting. I would also love another big naval combat title like Black Flag. I'm personally placing my bets on seeing a game that's set in Japan or China. That kind of setting change alone would promise a significantly different feel and style from what we've seen in the past few years. This propensity for change is probably my favorite element of the franchise, and it's what keeps me coming back year after year, even when the games go in directions I don't want them to. And for all of the criticism I lobby against Odyssey, it's far from my least favorite game in the series history. That honor goes to AC3, which I could, you know what, add it to the list. And the reason for that is, besides everything that frustrates me and everything I really wish they would do the opposite of in the future, it still told a pretty interesting story. If you haven't watched my video on Origins, you can check it out and see that I was really underwhelmed by the narrative of that game. In regards to Odyssey, I have far fewer complaints, at least purely when it comes to how technically well the story is structured. The character drama of Cassandra and Alexios piecing together their fractured family, for me, that stuff works. As far as Valhalla goes, they're bringing back Darby McDevitt as narrative lead. He's basically a genius, and he's brought us some of the best AC stories ever in Black Flag and Revelations. At the end of the day, that's what matters the most to me, putting the story forward.